we're getting lots of reports. I mean, I think we've now had about 3,000 reports on our various media platforms, not all of which are corruption related, but we're getting lots of reports, and we're starting to see, though the data is still at an early stage, we're starting to see interesting patterns, geographic patterns of conduct. We're getting an enormous amount of complaints, for example, about small towns and small municipalities, which I find really interesting because they often don't make the headlines of the big national newspapers. So yes, the evidence is strong. I also think, and this is an interesting comment on the perceptions of corruption, is that corruption has become something of a sort of metaphor for any unfair treatment. So you do get reports of stuff that is not corruption, but that is grossly unfair. And it's interesting that people should see unfair treatment as equated to corruption in some way or another. It's not always, but it tells you what people think about the extent and state of corruption in the country.
Sure. You know what, let me bring in Dr. Darrell Baliya, Head of Corruption and Governance Program at the Institute of Security Studies from our Seapoint studios. A very good morning to you, Dr. Baliya. Thank you for your time this morning.
Good morning.
Thanks indeed. Your thoughts then on the latest Transparency International's ranking of South Africa. Are you surprised?
No, not at all. I think the perception, we need to be clear that this is a perceptions index. You spoke a few minutes earlier about empirical evidence, and I think, as you correctly observed, corruption is not something that can be clinically or scientifically measured. So the most you can deal with here is an approximation to what is actually happening on the ground. And so we talk about perceptions, and you try to measure that, and that's what this index is doing. I think, part of our problem in this country is that whenever we talk corruption, it seems to always be somebody else's corruption and not one's own. So we need, some kind of national ownership of the problem. Corruption implicates, a lot of us, whether we're in the public sector or in the private sector. I think that point has to be made. I think we also have to recognize that corruption is something that has infested, succeeding generations of humankind the world over. It's not a peculiar, African problem. In recent years, one seems to get a sense here that when people say, corruption, they're actually talking about maladministration or anything, anything that the government does which does not work, and it seems to be equated to corruption. So I think we need to be a bit clinical in terms of what we mean and not use the term too loosely. I think it's also important for us to recognize that corruption is always two-sided. There's the corruptor and the corruptee. And with this, the Corruption Perceptions Index, we should be clear that, bribery is not the emphasis there. It is more reflection of, public sector corruption in terms of, interviews conducted with a number of business people, etc. So it is a bit one-sided. I think if you look at the bribery side, there is a case to be made for a lot of the corruption, emanating from outside of South Africa.
Sure.
But I think that said, Kolani, the concern I have about this index is that what is happening now, over against recent years, South Africa has slipped very badly compared to other African countries. We have Namibia, we have Botswana, we have Mauritius, and the Cape Verde, who have a higher rating than we do, and that is a problem for us, on the continent of Africa.
And that is why then we should ask these questions. What are the problem areas, do you think, Dr. Baliya? Do you think that perhaps we don't have adequate national legislation to deal with this?
Well, no. I really think we need to just hold back there, because whenever the problem of corruption rears its ugly head anywhere in the world, people rush to write up laws, and we have some of the most avant-garde global conventions now. But the problem seems to exacerbate itself. I think in South Africa we have a problem now in terms of perception with the entire procurement process. Whenever there's a contract out that is issued by government, it seems as if it invites the buying and selling of influence. So we have to find creative ways of dealing with this perception that government contracts are for sale depending on where one stands in terms of the buying and selling of influence. So for that reason, we have been advocating for quite some time now for the use of integrity pacts, where you engage in a pre-bidding process and you declare your credentials up front. You agree to a process of full transparency where all extra payments, or shall we call it commissions, or whatever of the whatever that nature may be, all those kinds of of issues of payments are put on the table, where the bidders know one another and they bind themselves to an agreement. And should they fail to honor those agreements or end up paying bribes or something of that sort, they will lose the contract or they will face penalties,
Yeah.
We need to find creative ways of dealing with this perception that government contracts, can be bought depending on one's level of influence.
But the argument, and perhaps I can bring you in here again, David, because the argument goes, it's a lot more than just procurement, the tender processes. The Public Service Commission reported on this just a couple of months ago, reporting such things as bribery, fraud, traffic officials, and you did something here with the JMPD, Johannesburg Metro Police, on issues of traffic officials soliciting bribes from motorists and officials receiving kickbacks and so on. It's widespread.
No, it is, and I think often something like nepotism, for example, irregularity in appointments, I think is a platform on which a huge amount of corruption is based. I said to you earlier that we are receiving a lot of reports of corruption in small towns.
Yeah.
I think that's largely it's largely rooted in how appointments are made and what the payback is for getting a good appointment in a juicy little Free State dorpy that allows you to cream off the top of a budget. And there are grey areas of political connectedness, if you like, that gives you a privilege and gives certain companies or individuals privilege in accessing contracts, sometimes that are not strictly illegal, but are not conduct becoming public administration. And those areas have got to be looked at as well. We are getting complaints, for example, which suggest there happen to be a hell of a lot of complaints from small Free State towns, and a lot of them concern what the people who are writing to us believe to be a nepotism or irregularity in appointments of town managers. You're not talking about places with, budgets the size of the arms deal. These are relatively small budgets, but they're enough to make a single individual and the cronies that he inevitably appoints to his positions relatively rich very, very quickly, and other people see this. And the attitude, I imagine, is either to say, well, if you can't beat them, join them,
Sure.
or, as I think we're seeing increasingly, what are euphemistically called service delivery protests, which is basically resentment at the fact that services in the form of a huge extraction of rents from the local budget seem to be going to a select few people and not to the communities whom they're intended to serve. And so this takes the form of a service delivery protest, which, as Daryl points out, may reflect a failed program, which I'm sure happens everywhere and in every country, or it may reflect corruption that starts with a bad appointment, an irregularity in an appointment.
Because these irregular appointments perhaps go to the heart of what Dr. Bhalia was talking about as well, where he talks about procurement processes and some of the problems arising out of that, because people then assume that you have appointed this manager so that you can get certain tenders, certain deals, and again, it just recurring accusations of you appointed your own manager so that you can give that kind of a person the tenders.
No, I think that's right. I mean, where the tender system is concerned, I can't believe that we can't tighten up our tender processes a lot. My understanding about tender processes, and I may be wrong, I'd be interested to know what the listeners think, is that we have an unusually fragmented and fractured tender process. I think that there needs to be, and I don't doubt that in institutions like the Treasury, a lot of attention is being given to this stuff. We need to think about tender processes that are relatively immunized from the decision-making of a large range of people and boards. I mean, we're also investigating the possibility of taking civil action against people who sit on tender boards and either take decisions in bad faith or fall asleep on the job and don't do their job properly. And we think if members of people who are responsible for issuing tenders start to realize that they can be held individually liable for what they are doing, this may concentrate their minds somewhat. But I can't believe that we can't fix up the tender process a little better than we're doing. The problem that I'm talking about of nepotism in the appointment of heads of public administrations, even of small towns, is somewhat different, but it definitely feeds into poor allocation of government work and government tenders.
Some of the survey findings, Transparency International suggesting that corruption problem getting worse in this nation, and we wanted to know from your point of view then, what is it that should be done? What is it that is not being done correctly? Let me read some emails, some SMSs. I'll look at the emails, then bring in my guests here. Toons, he says, corrupt people are selfish and only think of themselves. Another one says, our rating will worsen as long as the majority won't punish corruption at the elections ballot. For the majority, corruption is not an election issue. That's an SMS that came through a while ago. David, your responses to my callers, but also some of the SMSs and emails.
Yeah, just to take the Home Affairs issue first, which Daryl had used as an example, I agree with the callers. I think, and so do the people reporting to on our communications platforms, that Home Affairs in the issuing of passports and identity documents has improved enormously. And in fact, I really wish, and we have on our board a former Director General of Home Affairs who I think was in significant part responsible for many of these changes. I wish that story could be told. It would be really worthwhile knowing how they did it, because I think it's a successful instance of a turnaround. The one set of complaints we are getting about Home Affairs is around immigration issues. It seems that immigrants or potential immigrants are not being treated as well as South Africans are being treated by Home Affairs. But certainly where South Africans are applying for passports and IDs, there's been a significant improvement.